Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's Best Practices for Financial Modeling webinar. My name is Lauren Hogan, and I'm a Regional Marketing Coordinator here at JMT. We're very excited to have Gabi Koshgarian from Vicus Partners and Tony Pillari from Excelis Consulting joining us today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Tony and Gabi. If you have any questions during the webinar today, please go ahead and submit them into the Q&A section as you think of them. We'll save them all until the end of the presentation, but don't hesitate to submit them as they come. Also, just a reminder, we'll send out both some handouts and the recording of today's webinar within 24 hours after it has concluded. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Tony, to get us started.
Great, thank you so much. My name again is Tony Pillari. I'm the founder of Excelis Consulting. My focus is on strategic planning, which was the subject of a previous JMT seminar, and financial modeling based on those strategic plans for foundations, research institutes, universities, and other not-for-profit organizations. Prior to that, I spent some time at a consulting firm in the healthcare practice and also some time at a couple of different medical schools here in New York City. I'm very excited to be here today and to be presenting on this topic. I'll turn it over to Gabi to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabi. I am the COO of Vicus Partners based in Manhattan. I started my career in finance, first at a large tech company and then at a clean energy startup. I'm from Boston, go Patriots. I moved to New York City 4 years ago and now run a bunch of functions, including finance for Vicus as the COO. So if you don't know Vicus Partners, we represent tenants in commercial lease transactions. We're actually the only true tenant rep firm in the city, and that matters because when you're considering a lease, there's conflict of interest if your broker is representing both the tenant and the landlord. So that's a really important mission for us. And as you guys can all imagine, we've spent the past year now helping tenants in the city and elsewhere in the country navigate their lease and just general decisions around space during COVID, all of which involves a lot of financial modeling. So this is good timing.
Great. So our agenda for today, we'll talk about what a financial model actually is. We'll start there. We'll go through some best practices for financial modeling. We'll explain some best practices for structuring your inputs and for structuring your outputs. We'll talk about some of the mechanics of building your model. We'll do a quick recap, and then we'll try and save plenty of time at the end for Q&As. Again, submit them as they come up, and we'll get to them at the end. So what is a financial model? What do we mean when we say that? Basically, a financial model is a tool that lets you make explainable estimates about revenues and expenses over multiple years and under multiple conditions. So let's break that into its pieces. Explainable estimates, right? That means that the numbers you're coming up with are driven by some clear assumptions and some logical calculations, right? That you can explain, of course. Multiple years, models typically span 3 to 5 years. You can do shorter, you can do longer. The challenge with a longer time frame is those out years get harder and harder to estimate the further and further out you go. And multiple conditions. Right? You would typically design a model that can give you, say, a high, medium, low scenario, or a good, better, best, or a good, good, bad, worst in some cases, right? But something that gives you the flexibility to understand a variety of different scenarios that you're studying. So 2 general definitions, we'll use the terms inputs and outputs a lot. So inputs drive calculations. These can include salary and fringe, inflation factors, rent and space acquisition costs, those nuts and bolts that make up the numbers that you're putting into your model. Outputs, in turn, show the results of those calculations, right? An output can be something like a fully loaded annual salary. So that would be salary plus fringe plus an inflation factor. It might be an estimate for indirect cost recovery. So your grant revenues times your overhead rate. So that's what we mean, the distinction between inputs and outputs. I'll turn it over to Gabi to get us started.
Yep. So as Tony mentioned, the basic goal of your financial model is to help you or whoever you're sending it to, clients or constituents, understand what choices they have, different possible scenarios, and sometimes just answer a simple question of what should I do and make a best decision. So it is really important to understand what your model is relying on to answer that. So we're going to talk about inputs and outputs, as Tony mentioned, how to make your model's parameters and limitations clear, both for yourself and whoever might be looking at that model, how to navigate your assumptions, always be conservative. We'll talk about that more. How to change the model as time and decisions change. You want to make it really easy for your future self to do periodic reality checks. We'll talk about summary pages versus assumption tables, and how to use formulas, and then using a consistent approach to build the parts of your model. Notes for yourself and whoever's looking at your model, and then how to create a simple at-a-glance summary, which is helpful when you're actually presenting the model and you want to do that in a consumable way. So the first piece, considering your inputs. So you want to understand what costs and revenues you're actually including in your model and what you might be leaving out. So that can be, as the slide says, personnel costs, operating and administrative costs, capital costs, and revenues. I tend to only include sort of these costs in these categories that are actually going to move the needle or are key inputs. If it's really, really small, you can leave it out for ease or not, totally up to you. I tend to do one tab for each category with the assumptions and then one summary page. So that way you have your inputs and everything's clear in its own tab for personnel, and it separates it personnel from capital because those assumptions will be different. And then no matter what category you're talking about, everything should always be based on inputs. So you want everything to be changeable as decisions change and time goes on. You want to, like I said, make it easy for your future self. And then so you have these 4 categories that you know are going to go into your model. At the very beginning of creating a model, I always create extra tabs or extra line items for things that I'm not considering now, but will need to go into the model later. Again, just makes life easier for your future self. And you can make it, without even knowing what they are, you can make it very easy to change down the line. So the next piece, stating your parameters. So like I said, if you're trying to understand what decision to make based on this model, it's very important to understand what's actually going into it. So stating your modeling parameters explicitly, both for yourself and whoever might be looking at it. So some key parameters can include, are your calculations based on the fiscal academic calendar year? When does your model start and how long does it run? And did you include inflation, fringe, and overhead, and at what rates? So some of these are going to be numbers based and some will literally just be notes next to the numbers. Big fan of making very long process notes to myself, just so when you come back to the model, you know what your thought process was. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next piece is stating your model's limitations. So again, coming back to notes. So just like it's important to understand what your model is including, it's important to understand what it's not including or what might be an estimate. So you want to make that clear for yourself and whoever's looking at it. That way, when you outline what the key takeaways from your model are, you saying it, but it's based in these key assumptions and making it really clear what's an estimate versus what's a known. So as the slide says, you want to be clear about what's an estimate and what is a target, and that underlying conditions may change. You can't anticipate the changes, but your model should adapt to them, which again goes back to making everything an input. So as we said throughout, always be conservative. It's so much easier to bring costs down or revenues up than the other way around. And then periodically conducting reality checks. So I mentioned making everything in the model flow easily with inputs and assumptions. So as decisions change or time goes on, you might need to actually change different inputs in the model. I try to do, depending on who the client is or what it's for, at least every couple of weeks or as I receive new information. So some of these can be, are your proposed salaries realistic given who you're trying to recruit and what's going on in the marketplace? If you're adding staff, is your hiring schedule realistic? Do you have space to house your people and for them to interact effectively? Is the growth in revenues and expenses realistic given your history? And are revenues and expenses in line with each other? And if not, why not? So it's sort of placing a conceptual lens on the numbers. And I try to do this regularly, just so I understand that the model is the most updated and giving the best takeaways. Tony, back to you.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Let's talk a bit about some of the mechanics of model building. So let's start with talking about assumptions tables. You should try and use assumptions tables for your inputs as much as you can. And what these tables do is it makes it easier for you as the model builder to construct your formulas, right? Because you're constantly referring back to the same set of assumptions. Practically speaking, it makes it very easy to copy and paste those formulas too, which saves a lot of time. Just as important, it makes it easy to change those formulas. If you change one cell in an assumptions table, you can effectively be changing dozens and dozens of formulas, right? And that's a much more efficient approach. So for the model user, your audience, your customer, having an assumptions table helps them understand the big picture, right? All the key assumptions you've made are in one place or a few places and laid out in a way that makes sense. This helps them question those assumptions and hopefully accept them, which can be a process sometimes. And then also understand the results of your calculations. When you show an output to someone, if they understand how you put that number together and what assumptions underlie it, it really speeds understanding. So as a rule, try and keep your assumptions in a single table on a separate tab. You can have multiple tables on multiple tabs. The idea is just have them in a concise place, because this makes it easier to make updates and also avoids confusing the audience, right? There's some exceptions to this put everything in a single place rule, but our thinking is, only put the numbers in front of your audience that they really need to see, right? And if you overcrowd their field of view, it makes it hard to understand exactly the point you're trying to make. So here's an example. This is an example of the inflation rate section of an assumptions table, right? So you might have multiple inflation rates for things like salary, for things like non-salary items like office supplies. You may have some very specialized things like IT, software, if you're in the biomed space, reagents and lab supplies. Those costs can increase much more quickly than normal inflation. So this table, everything is laid out. Here are the different categories of inflation. Here's the basic rate, 3%, 5%. And then year by year, these are the inflation factors that you'll use to build your formula. So very concise, very clean, all in one place. Now, you can refer to your assumptions throughout the model, right? Notes, notes, notes. We'll keep saying that because it's very important. But again, it's often simplest to keep those details hidden, but accessible, certainly, and to be able to explain them. If you put an assumption in the model, you need to be able to explain it and give the rationale for why it's there and why the number is what it is. The one exception that we might make to this rule is when you're dealing with personnel data, particularly salary data. And in a case like that, it might be helpful to display a lot of those assumptions within the body of the model itself. So here's an example of what I mean. So this is a very simple salary calculation for 10 positions, random distribution of start dates and salaries and efforts and things like that, right? So if you look at this particular cell, position 2 in year 1, salary says $75,000. Now you can certainly click in that cell and understand how you derive that number with, and then look up the assumptions on a separate tab. That's easy. But what I found is, particularly for a number like this, because salary is often going to be the biggest non-capital component of your model, it's the kind of thing that you're going to get a lot of questions about. What's the salary? What's the start date? What's the position? So if you structure your inputs so that they're all very visible, with the start date, with the base salary, with the percent effort for the initiative you're trying to model, this $75,000 number becomes very easy to understand, right? Oh, that person is starting mid-year, or it's at the start of the year. Base salary is 150K, and half their effort is going to this project, 750K, I get it. And then you look at year 2, oh, why did that number go up? Oh, that's right, inflation. There was a note about that everything is inflated by 3%. But, I can assume that none of these other parameters changed. Right, so that's just one example of how, 2 different approaches. Keep everything in one place, spread it through the model where and when it makes sense. As Gabi was saying, when you think about outputs, use formulas. It can be very hard to understand where one typed in number or hard-coded number comes from. right? So that $75,000 number, if that was just typed in there and you didn't have those assumptions, there was no formula behind it, it's hard to know what that number means, right? Multiply that by 10 or 100, right? All those different types and typed in numbers make it really hard to understand the message that you're trying to deliver, how you came up with these outputs, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. As for your formulas themselves, make sure that they're clear and transparent. The reason for that, and I'll explain what that means, the reason for that is anyone looking at the model, right? And you have to be somewhat familiar with Excel, I suppose, but anyone looking at the model should be able to do two things: identify where each input in your formula came from, and then understand why that input belongs in the formula, right? So for example, if you're structuring a formula that gives you an annual salary for someone, you want to look at, their base salary. You want to look at their percent effort for what you model. You want to look at what's the relevant inflation rate. You want to factor in their start date. And if you take that logical approach of consistently building the model in that same way, anyone looking at the formula can figure it out. Oh, base salary times effort, start date, inflation, I get it. The other important reason for using formulas that are clear and transparent, and those assumptions tables, of course, is anyone updating the model should be able to do those two things, right? See where the inputs come from, understand where they come from, but also change them. Right? And as your model gets more and more complex, you'll see that this approach of assumptions in one place, logically structured formulas that are clear and transparent and consistent will save you a lot of time and make it much easier to answer those questions when they come up. If you only remember one thing from this presentation, we really want it to be that you should never, ever, ever hard code an output and in the fine print unless you absolutely have to. And we'll give you some examples where you may absolutely have to. So here's that salary table again, right? So you may be asking at this point, well, what's the problem with hard coding an output, or what's the problem with hard coding parts of a formula, right? That's a very easy thing to do, right? So why can't I just put in the base salary into the formula? And the reason is transparency, right? It makes that number invisible. You kind of have to click into the formula to understand where it's coming from, just to answer a simple question. You might be saying, well, why don't I put in the percent effort? I know it's going to be 50% and that won't change. So do I really need an assumptions table? It's like, well, with the assumptions table, if things do change, it's very easy to make those updates. And again, it's transparency, right? You can see what that effort is. You can get a sense of how people are spending their effort. And then last but not least, and I've seen this a lot, why don't I just type in 6 divided by 12? If someone is starting on July 1st, I know that's half a year, 6 months divided by 12 months, I should be all set. That's true, but if a start date changes, you have to go back in and undo and redo all those formulas. And you'll see as you construct these models, in my experience at least, start date and salary are two things that you're going to be constantly updating, right? Because you have a recruit in mind, they want more money than you budgeted. You want a recruit to start right away, and they can't. They need another month. So being able to change those assumptions and have it flow through the formula is really, really a best practice. And last but not least, you should be consistent in how you structure the model. So what I mean is, for example, let's say you have one worksheet for staff salaries and another one for executives, or you have one worksheet for rent or renovation costs for one space and a separate one for another space, right? Structure those two to be as identical as possible. Right? They won't be absolutely the same. You might have different line items, whatever. But the general idea of making sure that they share a common DNA, if you will, is something important to keep in mind. And this is really, really important when you get to scenario building. So if you're putting together different tabs in a model that show, as we talked about, that good, better, best case, when you present that to someone, if you're showing them the detail behind your thinking, you want them to focus on what your message is. You don't want them to be distracted about how things are laid out, or how you grouped your assumptions or how you grouped your formulas or anything like that, right? So that whole idea of consistency and how you structure your formulas and how you set up your assumptions tables and how you structure the model itself is really very important. I'll turn it over to Gabi now to close us out.
All right, back to notes. So 2 pieces of this. You won't always remember all the assumptions and decisions you're making at the time that you're building the model unless you write them down. And then your users or whoever's looking at or using the model may not understand those assumptions and decisions unless you actually explain them. So 2 things here. I'm a big fan, as I said, of making notes to myself in the actual assumptions tab, and sometimes actually in the formulas of where numbers are coming from. And that's just notes about the conceptual logic behind my thought process. And you can actually bake notes into a formula without affecting the formula. It's equals n. So same way you would do a sum or anything in Excel, it's the n function, which allows you to put any notes right into the formula, and it still comes out as a numerical update. So I love that function and use it all the time. Like I said, my future self often thanks me. And then when it comes to outlining assumptions for the actual users of the model, I'll sometimes put notes in italics or some way that they know it's a note to them next to the actual numbers I'm using. And sometimes, depending on who it is, I might actually create a separate tab that doesn't have all of the crazy inputs that I'm looking at, that just outlines key assumptions. Especially if you're sending an email along with the model, I'll always highlight not just the key takeaways of the model, but what are the key assumptions, because you can't really have one without the other. And then the second piece is make sure everything is labeled clearly. So your worksheet should have a clear title, whether it's summary or assumptions or whatever it is. And then every section of the worksheet should have a clear label, so it's easily consumable. The next piece is creating a simple summary sheet. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. I always have a summary sheet that I show clients or whoever's looking at it, and I hide everything else. So I keep assumptions in a separate tab, and then any specific things that are feeding into assumptions like taxes or other costs, salary, whatever it is, in its own tab, and just show the summary sheet. And that's should be what your audience wants and needs to know most. And that's front and center, helps them make a super quick, educated decision without having to dig too much into the model. And then if your summary is getting too complicated, consider having 2 views, a snapshot and then a comprehensive summary. So I actually do this all the time. I'll have one summary sheet that's intended for whoever's looking at it, one summary sheet that I call like the detailed summary. That's a little bit more detail by line item of that snapshot. And then the assumptions tabs and any other tabs that are feeding into assumptions, which I'll hide whenever I'm sending a model. It's just cleaner that way. And like I said, whenever I send notes along with a model, I always create this little outline that's key takeaways and key assumptions. So the idea is they don't even have to open the model if they don't want to. And then to recap, a financial model is a tool that lets you make logical estimates about revenues and or expenses over multiple years. So it's intended to answer a specific question, lay out possible decisions or scenarios, and can be used to make a quick, informed decision. Best practices for financial modeling include stating your parameters, assumptions, and limitations clearly and using notes and labels freely, making conservative assumptions and doing periodic reality checks, using assumption tables for your inputs. Like I mentioned, I usually keep that as a separate tab. I also make all of my assumptions blue so that both I and whoever's looking at it know that that's an assumption, and I keep all formulas black. Using formulas that are clear and transparent. I also mentioned that within those formulas, I'll often use the equals n Excel function to just make notes to myself or whoever's looking at it. Use a consistent approach for all parts of your model and create a simple summary tailored to your audience. Like I mentioned, the summary is usually the only thing I'll show when I send to a client. I think we'll open it up for questions. Tony, we good to open it up for Q&A?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tony and Gabi, so much for the presentation. It looks like we do have a couple of questions, but don't forget, you can always submit any of them into the Q&A section. We'd be happy to answer. So we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like the first question we have is, what software are your clients using? Excel?
Pretty much exclusively Excel, yeah.
Same
Okay.
here, we always use Excel.
Okay, and then the next question we have is, how does the notes differ from the comments function in Excel?
Ooh, that's a good question. So comments, if I'm hearing it correctly, I think the comment is you right click and you add a comment to a specific cell. I usually use that if I want someone else to see a comment to a number or an assumption. The notes, the equals n notes function, I usually use when it's more a note to myself. And I'll do these like long drawn out logic notes. And people aren't really going into the formulas that are using the model aside from you. So those are more for me.
Okay. Yeah, just a reminder, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar, as well as the slides at the end. And then our next question is, what is the equal end function?
Oh, the equal n as in Nancy function? Is that what they're asking?
They said end, but they could possibly mean the equal n.
Okay, yeah, it's probably just someone misheard me. It's equal n as in Nancy. So it's the same thing as if you were doing a mathematical, like a sum or anything in Excel. It just allows you to actually put text in quotation marks as notes within the formula without impacting the actual formula. So for example, if you do, instead of doing equals 1 plus 1, and it has an output of 2, if you want to do equals 1 plus n, and then in quotes, you put where that first one came from, then plus 1 and plus n where that second one came from, just helps you remember where things are coming from in your logic or why you're doing a formula a certain way, especially when the formula is complicated and has multiple Excel functions built into it. I always find it really helpful. And I'm happy to send this over email or walk anyone through it that needs help after this.
Perfect. And then our next question is, what's your best tip to make sure everything can be rolled forward?
So I'll go first on this one. I think it's structuring your tabs consistently, right? So there's kind of an upper limit. There's only so much you can automate in Excel, and there will be times where you have to hunt to find particular formulas, et cetera. But if you're structuring things in a consistent way, that's probably the best way to make sure that when you roll things forward, it's clear, it's logical, and it's easy for you to do. That's important too. You can spend a lot of time working on models. So anything that you can do to make yourself more efficient and increase the impact of the message you're trying to deliver is worthwhile.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd also add just making everything an input, like Tony was talking about before. Even if you think it's something that's not going to change, it's always easier to follow a formula when it's based in inputs, and it might change. And the last thing future you wants to be doing is digging around the cells trying to find the hard codes. So everything as an input. And like I said, I make assumptions blue, which also really helps me when I go back in to change things.
Perfect. And then our next two questions are pretty similar. The first one is, do you have a template for your clients to start populating the information? And then the next one is, do you help your clients develop dashboards to summarize data and help make management decisions?
Yeah, Tony, I can take that one first.
Yeah, please.
The template, it's almost impossible to keep the template as is every single time, unfortunately, but we do have a template that we use and share and work off of, and that makes life so much easier. And within that template, it has a summary sheet, a detailed summary, and assumptions tab. So typically I'll just work in the assumptions tabs and then outline as needed for the client. And they'll use the summary and sometimes the detailed summary for things like board meetings or talking to the founders or whoever the decision makers are that are answering the question the model is supposed to answer.
Yeah, I use the exact same approach. You have that template that you have to tweak a little bit each time, but you really want to produce something that's easy to work with, that can be reused by a given client, that's simple, that's structured in a sound way. So yeah, absolutely. Again, the more consistent you can be, even in terms of building model A and then moving on to model B, the more time you save and the more you can really focus on the outputs of your model and the message that you're trying to deliver, and not so much the model building.
I also will add one thing. I mentioned that I usually work in the assumptions tab only and then hide it. if there are key dial mover assumptions, like 3 or 4 big ones, and you think in a board meeting or some kind of meeting of the decision makers, they might need to actually manipulate the model in real time without you, you can create another tab that's just high level or key assumptions. That's, you'd spend 5 minutes walking your client or whoever through how to use it. And it's usually just typing in a few numbers. Assumptions will be blue or highlighted or some way to denote their assumptions. And that way they feel empowered that they can change those 3 or 4 key assumptions live during the meeting without having to actually dive into the more complicated assumptions tab.
And I saw there was another question about building dashboards. That's a really great question. I have done that. I actually did it recently for a client at a large university in the mid-Atlantic to help them build their COVID dashboard, right? And you see lots of great COVID dashboards out there, especially Johns Hopkins. And that started as a simple Excel model, right? What inputs, things like number of infections, number of students tested, et cetera, what inputs do we need to put together and structure in a logical way so that we have a way to capture this information? And that was a very different kind of model because that's wasn't financial, but it doesn't have to be a financial model. And it's day-to-day inputs. I mean, it's a number of different people plugging information into that Excel model. And then that Excel model rolled up into Tableau. If you're not familiar with Tableau, it's a data visualization program that is really amazing. It can pull data from lots of different sources, including Excel. It allows you to structure very meaningful and impactful visuals and then string those together into a dashboard. Now, you don't have to use something like Tableau. You can, construct perfectly good and functional, and actually very good and very functional dashboards in Excel as well. But the idea that you're getting at of that simple view, particularly for numbers that are going to change, or if you're working against a particular target, or if you want to measure how much of your budget have you consumed, that's sort of next level thinking when it comes to financial modeling. Okay, how do I turn all this information into one impactful message and display that, most likely, if you're talking about a dashboard, in a very visual and hopefully intuitive way? So that's a great question.
Perfect. And then our next question is, do you recommend or not recommend doing assumptions by product or project programs instead of by GL items?
Yeah, I think the answer is it depends. I tend to think more in terms of those general ledger items. But there may be cases where if your programs and projects, they may share common general ledger items, right? Like salary or supplies or things like that. But the specifics of the programs may be so different that you need a separate set of programmatic assumptions. In a case like that, that's how I would tackle it. I would have those programmatic assumptions specific to the program, those more line item GL assumptions, and then probably separate tabs for the different programs. If they're that different, you probably want to think of them in a separate way, separate but consistent way. Gabi, what's your take on that one? It's a good question. It's tough.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also sometimes tackle that by sort of combining them into one tab and then putting all of the universal assumptions that will stay the same across any programs at the top. And then the different scenarios or programs below that where you're more manipulating the assumptions. And that way you have the 5 or 6 or however many universal assumptions at the top, and you can link every scenario line item up to that. So if you make the change once, it flows through everything. I find that easier than making separate assumptions tabs. I try to keep as much as I can assumptions in one tab. Sometimes it's not possible, but it's sort of user dependent, but that's how I tackle it.
Okay, great. Let's see, we have one more question, it looks like. And can you give us some real life examples of how you use financial modeling for clients?
Yeah, I can start, and then Tony, you can piggyback.
Yeah.
So I mentioned we do commercial office leasing. So for deals, companies are often considering different spaces to take, and each space has its own price tag and then associated costs within that space, and that can differ. So we'll look at financial models to compare those space options and associated costs and help answer the question, if I have a specific budget, which space works for me? If I love this space, how much am I going to have to stretch my budget? Which spaces are charging for operating expenses versus what's included? Any kinds of space questions comparatively across different spaces. The model really, really helps. And then the summary is very easily digestible for them. They can, based on whatever question they're trying to answer, they can look at a couple cells and know the answer quickly. We also, during COVID, I mentioned we've been helping tenants figure out their space decisions. We've done a lot of modeling around what's your existing lease or leases and your space portfolio in terms of your bottom line versus here's what we can save you, or here's what you'll save moving to a different space. Here's what you'll save if you buy out of your lease. So taking the sort of like base case of what your lease is now or your space portfolio versus what we can do for you, that's often really helpful in getting hired. And then that will also change. So we'll make, I'll give you an example. For a buyout of a lease, we'll propose a buyout at X% to a landlord, and we'll model that for our clients. The landlord will then counter propose a higher percentage, and we'll have to change the model to reflect that and continuously change the model, which is also why it's important that everything is an input, because it's the difference between it takes 2 seconds to change an input versus you have to go through and look at all your hard codes. So those are the two main ones for us. What about you, Tony?
Yeah, I have two good examples. One I'm working on right now and one that I worked on a long time ago, but they're very, very different. So one I'm working on right now, it's with one of the medical schools here in New York City, and I'm helping them construct the financial models for the recruitment packages for department chairs. So it's a number of different departments and one model per department, but then also creating a consolidated roll-up that pulls all of those together. So for folks who aren't familiar with faculty recruitment, particularly for a chair, it can get complicated because there are all sorts of nuances involved. So you bring a department chair in, and let's say it's a research department, and all these departments have either research departments or a big research component. So you would give that person a certain amount of funding to run his or her own lab. Right? So you give a startup package that would cover that person's salary, probably the purchase of equipment, maybe funds that they could use to hire lab assistants, buy supplies, et cetera. Right? So that's one set of information that you have to process and make sense out of. But then particularly for a department chair, then they're going to want to bring in other faculty members. Right? So you have to model that out as well. How many faculty are they going to get? What are their salaries, their start dates? What are their expectations in terms of research funding, et cetera? And then, the process can continue down to the next level. Sometimes those faculty are senior enough that they want to recruit other faculty. So you have to model that out as well. So it's the same approach we've been talking about. I have a big assumptions page where I keep all my assumptions. I have different tabs for the different GL components, if you want to call them that. So there's one for just general lab supplies. There's one for capital equipment. There's one for salary, because those are the big buckets that I tend to think in, and really how, these recruitment packages are put together. So there are 6 departments, and then rolling them up into a consolidated view. And that's been the really challenging part, because it goes back to what Gabi was saying earlier. Sometimes you need a summary, and sometimes you need a detailed summary, right? And people tease me that detailed summary is an oxymoron, but I'm not sure that it really is. So when you start rolling up these numbers together, if all you show is one number for each department, that's great at a glance. That's something the dean of the medical school is going to want to see, but you need to be able to drill down a little bit deeper than that. So it's been this interesting process of figuring what's the right balance of detail to get the message across to the final viewer. And then, as you move down from that summary view to the department views, the level of detail really expands, because at a department level, really have to be able to understand where's the money going, right? Person by person, not necessarily day by day, but year by year, certainly. So that's one thing I'm working on now. A previous project that I worked on was a research initiative in California where they had earmarked $3 billion in funding to support various stem cell research initiatives across the state. That was interesting because that was tackled much more programmatically. So this was a grant-making agency. So we had to think about what are the programs we want to design, what are the research programs, types of programs we want to support, and then allocate funding across those programs across the years. But then we also had to think at a very operational level, right? If you'd be surprised how hard it is to give away $3 billion. But if you're starting these research programs or these grant application programs, you need to think about, who's going to review all these grants? How many grants can we realistically give out in what period of time, right? So timing became very important. If you have a grant application cycle, a review cycle, an award cycle, thinking about how you spread out the distribution of that money was very important. So it was a lot of iteration back and forth. Okay, this is our rough idea on how much funding we want to allocate. These are the types of grants we want to give and how much money we think is involved. This is the general timing we think we want to launch this program in. And then you plug that into your model and you realize that we don't have the bandwidth to give out this many grants in this year. Or you realize that the sequencing of these programs is all wrong. We really need to build a base of basic information before we can start thinking about developing therapies, for example. So there's a lot of really interesting back and forth where the ultimate model was all about finances, but there was a lot of interesting thinking about the operations behind that. And we had a separate sort of, operational throughput model that helped us understand, okay, how many grants can we really give out in a year, over the course of the 10 years of the program. So that was really fun. That was very challenging because you had to use the operations side and the finance side of your brain in tandem. We worked really closely with the client on that. It was really fun exercise to think these things through and get around the table and map things out on the whiteboard and then turn it into a model and then review the model and make those updates. But again, we structured it so that the assumptions were clear. The inputs were very easy to see. The output formulas were really logical. So as we tweaked things, small changes allowed us to see big results in terms of how we laid out this program.
Okay, thank you all so much. That looks like that was all the questions we had come through. A few of y'all wanted to be contacted by Gabi after this webinar has concluded, so I'll make sure to pass along your information. And then, Tony, if you don't mind putting up that slide real quick, and we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. Tony, do you have the slide pulled up?
Oh, sorry. Pull that up real quick.
That's okay.
Oh, sorry. Having some technical difficulties here.
It's okay, I'll just go ahead. To perform complex financial modeling, you'll need the right technology in place. If you're using legacy software and want to learn more about how easy and affordable JMT makes the process of upgrading to a more powerful modern solution, we'd love to chat with you. And book a short consultation with our experts by next Thursday, and we'll send you a $10 Starbucks gift card so you can enjoy a cup of coffee on us while we chat. All you have to do is just visit jmtconsulting.com/chat, put time on our calendar, and we look forward to connecting with you. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude our webinar. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you Tony and Gabi for the great presentation. And we look forward to seeing y'all again.
Likewise.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.